Sometimes the bravest signature is the one written by someone who believes happiness was never meant for them. Olivia Brooks stared at the marriage contract resting beneath the crystal chandelier, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as the polished silver pen waited in silence beside the final page. The royal council chamber was magnificent, its soaring stone columns disappearing into vaulted ceilings painted with wolves beneath a full moon. Yet all she could hear was the quiet beating of her own heart. Around the long oak table stood nobles dressed in elegant winter colors, advisors holding neatly organized documents, and palace attendants waiting with perfect stillness. No one spoke. No one smiled. The silence carried the weight of tradition, duty, and decisions that could never be undone. Olivia lowered her eyes toward the parchment one last time. Every carefully written line reminded her that this marriage was not born from romance. It was an agreement between noble houses, approved by the royal council and sealed under ancient pact law. She had spent the previous 3 nights reading every clause until sunrise, searching for a hidden escape that did not exist. Instead, she had found promises of responsibility, loyalty, and life inside the Alpha King's palace. There had been nothing cruel written there, yet kindness had never needed ink to disappear. She had heard enough stories growing up. Powerful alphas married for alliances. Omegas fulfilled expectations quietly. Hearts were rarely consulted. Miss Brooks, the elderly royal secretary, offered a respectful nod. Whenever you are ready. Olivia drew one slow breath before lifting the pen. She did not look toward the far end of the chamber, where the Alpha King stood beside the tall windows overlooking snow-covered mountains. She had only seen him once before from across a crowded ceremonial hall. Even then, his calm expression had revealed almost nothing. They called him a wise ruler. They called him an undefeated leader. They called him the strongest alpha of his generation. No one had ever described him as approachable. That frightened her more than anything else. She gently signed her name across. The final line, each graceful letter feeling strangely heavier than the last. When the pen finally left the paper, something inside her quietly accepted that the life she had known until this morning had ended. The secretary carefully collected the contract with practiced hands while several council members exchanged approving nods. Across the chamber, the Alpha King stepped forward. His movements were steady, unhurried, carrying the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to every eye following him. Olivia finally gathered enough courage to look up. Their eyes met for only a brief moment. His golden gaze remained calm, thoughtful, almost unreadable, yet there was no coldness within it. Before she could understand why that unexpected detail unsettled her, he offered a single courteous inclination of his head. It was neither distant nor overly familiar, simply respectful. "Welcome," he said in a quiet voice that carried easily through the chamber, "to your new home." The word surprised her. Home. She had expected duty, obligation, perhaps even polite formality. Home had never crossed her mind. Still, she quickly reminded herself not to mistake kindness for affection. Palaces were filled with beautiful words. Real life often sounded very different once the doors closed. As palace attendants gently guided her through endless marble corridors glowing beneath warm lantern light, Olivia resisted the urge to glance behind her. Somewhere beyond those towering walls, the home where she had grown up was already becoming a memory. Ahead waited a future she had never chosen. Inside a palace she barely understood, beside a king whose heart she believed would forever remain beyond her reach. The palace was quieter than Olivia had imagined. As she followed a pair of attendants through long marble corridors bathed in the soft glow of afternoon sunlight, she realized the silence was not cold. It was careful. Every servant who passed offered a respectful bow before continuing their work without lingering for curious glances or whispered conversations. No one stared at her as though she were an outsider. Somehow, that unexpected courtesy unsettled her even more than open judgment would have. She had prepared herself for awkward smiles, forced politeness, and the invisible distance reserved for political brides. Instead, the palace moved around her with calm precision, as though her arrival had been expected for far longer than a single day. "This way, Lady Brooks," one attendant said gently as enormous carved oak doors slowly opened before her. Olivia stepped inside and stopped without realizing it. The room was beautiful, but not in the overwhelming way she had feared. Warm, cream-colored walls reflected the late afternoon light pouring through tall windows that overlooked snow-covered gardens. A comfortable reading chair rested beside a stone fireplace, where gentle flames danced behind polished ironwork. Shelves stood neatly arranged with books instead of expensive decorations, while fresh white flowers filled crystal vases without appearing extravagant. Everything felt elegant, yet strangely welcoming. Her eyes slowly traveled across the room before settling on a small wooden music box resting near the window. She walked toward it almost instinctively. The carved pattern on its lid looked remarkably similar to the one her late mother had once owned. She reached out carefully, but stopped just before touching it. The similarity felt impossible. "Would you like us to unpack your belongings?" another attendant asked politely. Olivia blinked, pulling herself back to the present. "Yes, thank you." The women quietly began arranging the few dresses, books, and personal keepsakes she had brought from home. Olivia noticed they handled every item with remarkable care, placing each belonging as though it already had a place waiting for it. She wandered slowly through the adjoining rooms. A writing desk overlooked the eastern mountains exactly where the morning sun would rise. The bedroom windows welcomed soft winter light instead of the harsh afternoon glare. Even the blankets folded neatly across the bed were made from the same kind of thick woven wool she had always preferred during cold seasons. She frowned slightly. Perhaps every royal chamber looked like this. She told herself there was nothing unusual about thoughtful furnishings. Inside a palace. Still, an unfamiliar feeling lingered quietly in the back of her mind. It almost resembled recognition. Evening settled gently across the palace as lanterns flickered to life outside the windows. A servant arrived carrying a silver tray with warm vegetable soup, fresh bread, roasted root vegetables, herbal tea, and slices of honey pear. Olivia looked at the simple meal with surprise. It was not the lavish royal banquet she had expected. It looked remarkably similar to the comforting dinners she often prepared for herself back home after long days working in the village gardens. "His Majesty apologizes that official matters require his attention this evening," the servant explained with a respectful smile. "He wished to ensure your first night here would be peaceful." Olivia thanked her quietly after the woman departed, then sat alone beside the fire listening to the gentle crackle of burning wood. She wrapped both hands around the warm teacup and stared into the dancing flames. The palace still felt unfamiliar, the future still uncertain, and the marriage contract remained very real. Yet as the winter wind whispered softly beyond the windows, she found herself wondering why every corner of this enormous place somehow carried the comforting feeling of a home she had not yet learned to remember. Olivia slept only because exhaustion finally overcame uncertainty, but even then her dreams wandered endlessly through unfamiliar hallways where every closed door seemed to hide a future she could not yet understand. When the first rays of dawn slipped through the tall eastern windows, she opened her eyes expecting the same uneasy feeling that had followed her since signing the marriage contract. Instead, she found herself staring at soft golden light spilling gently across the room, warming the polished wooden floor and painting delicate shadows over the bookshelves beside the fireplace. For a long moment, she simply listened. The palace was beginning to wake. Somewhere in the distance, she heard quiet footsteps, the faint ringing of breakfast bells, and birds singing beyond the frosted gardens. None of it felt hurried. None of it felt intimidating. She slowly sat up, surprised to discover she had slept peacefully through the entire night. That alone seemed impossible. She wrapped the warm blanket around her shoulders before walking toward the window. Outside, snow rested like white velvet across carefully trimmed hedges, while the first gardeners quietly brushed fresh powder from stone pathways. Everything appeared calm, almost welcoming. Turning back toward the room, her attention settled on details she had overlooked the previous evening. Beside the reading chair rested a woven basket filled with several novels written by her favorite authors, including an old edition she had searched for unsuccessfully in village bookshops years before. Near the writing desk stood a vase holding fresh white lilies, the very flowers her mother used to place beside the family window every winter because they reminded her that beauty often survived the coldest seasons. Olivia blinked in surprise. She stepped closer and noticed the writing desk itself. Its smooth walnut surface held carefully arranged parchment, fresh ink, and a silver fountain pen positioned exactly where her right hand naturally reached. Even the chair had been adjusted to a comfortable height. How could anyone know this? She whispered to herself. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Good morning, Lady Brooks. A cheerful maid greeted as she entered carrying breakfast. I hope you rested well. Olivia thanked her before glancing at the tray. Warm cinnamon oatmeal topped with fresh berries sat beside honey pastries and herbal tea prepared with lavender and mint. She smiled faintly in disbelief. This is my favorite breakfast. The maid returned the smile without appearing surprised. I am very glad to hear that. Before Olivia could ask another question, the maid quietly excused herself, leaving only curiosity behind. After breakfast, Olivia wandered into the dressing room connected to her chamber. Neatly arranged inside the wardrobe hung elegant gowns chosen in colors she had always preferred without ever telling anyone. Soft blue, forest green, ivory. There was not a single extravagant crimson dress or jewel-covered gown that would have made her uncomfortable. Beneath the window rested a small rocking chair almost identical to the one her grandfather had handcrafted when she was a little girl. She slowly lowered herself into it, gently running her fingers across the polished wood. Her chest tightened with emotions she could not explain. None of these things belonged in a palace chosen for a political marriage. They belonged inside memories she had never shared beyond her family home. As morning sunlight continued filling every corner with quiet warmth, Olivia found herself asking a question that lingered more heavily than the contract she had signed the day before. If this marriage had truly been nothing more than duty, then who had gone to such extraordinary lengths to make a stranger feel as though she had somehow awakened exactly where she had always belonged? Olivia could not silence the question echoing through her mind. So after breakfast, she quietly left her chamber and wandered into the palace library, hoping the familiar comfort of books might steady her thoughts. The library stretched across two magnificent floors, its towering walnut shelves lined with thousands of carefully preserved volumes, while morning sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, scattering soft colors across polished stone floors. She slowly traced her fingertips along rows of leather-bound books until she noticed an elderly woman arranging fresh flowers beside one of the reading tables. Her silver hair was neatly pinned beneath a simple lace cap, and despite her modest clothing, every passing servant greeted her with obvious respect. You must be Lady Brooks, the woman said with a warm smile before Olivia even introduced herself. I am Margaret, the senior housekeeper. Welcome home. That single word caught Olivia off guard once again. Home. She returned the smile politely. Everyone keeps calling this home. Margaret adjusted the flowers thoughtfully before answering. His Majesty insisted that it should feel that way. Olivia hesitated. He did. The older woman nodded naturally, as though the answer required no explanation. For several weeks, every room prepared for you was reviewed personally. Olivia stared at her. Several weeks. Margaret looked mildly surprised by her reaction. Of course, His Majesty requested reports about your favorite colors, the books you enjoy reading, the flowers that reminded you of your childhood, the meals you preferred after long days, even which direction your bedroom window faced when you were growing up. Olivia felt the world around her grow strangely quiet. That cannot be right, she whispered. We had never even met. Margaret's expression softened. No, you had not. She carefully placed the final white lily into its vase before continuing. His Majesty believed that was exactly why he should prepare. He said arriving in an unfamiliar palace would already be difficult enough without asking you to surrender every comfort you had ever known. Olivia lowered her eyes, trying to understand what she had just heard. The rocking chair, the lilies, the books, the breakfast. None of it had been coincidence. Someone had deliberately recreated fragments of her ordinary life inside these grand palace walls. Why would he do that? She asked quietly. Margaret smiled with the gentle patience of someone who had watched many seasons pass. His Majesty rarely explains his heart aloud. He simply acts. Before Olivia could ask another question, the distant sound of a clock chiming through the palace signaled the beginning of the royal council meeting. Margaret gathered her flower basket and paused beside the library doors. One more thing, my lady. Olivia looked up. The Alpha King visited your chamber himself 3 separate times before your arrival. Olivia blinked in disbelief. Margaret continued, not to admire it. To remove anything he thought might make you uncomfortable. He wanted your first morning here to feel peaceful instead of overwhelming. The older woman offered a respectful bow before quietly leaving the library. Olivia remained standing among the endless shelves, surrounded by books she suddenly could no longer see. Her gaze drifted toward the eastern windows where snowflakes floated gently beyond the glass. She had signed a marriage contract believing she was walking into a carefully negotiated alliance between noble families. Instead, someone she barely knew had spent weeks quietly learning how to make a stranger feel safe before she ever crossed the palace gates. And for the first time since placing her name upon that parchment, Olivia wondered if perhaps the greatest mystery inside the palace was not the marriage itself, but the quiet heart of the king who had prepared a place for her long before destiny ever brought her home. The palace settled into its quiet rhythm over the next several days, and Olivia slowly discovered that the Alpha King was almost never where people expected him to be. Every morning, she found a fresh pot of herbal tea waiting outside her chamber just before sunrise, always brewed exactly the way she preferred, never too strong and never too sweet. No servant claimed responsibility. Every afternoon, the fireplace in her sitting room was already warm before the winter air could creep inside, and each evening, a small vase of fresh white lilies appeared beside the window before dusk painted the garden silver. No notes accompanied these thoughtful gestures. No announcement declared who had arranged them. Yet after Margaret's quiet revelation, Olivia could no longer believe they happened by chance. Still, the Alpha King himself remained strangely distant. Not cold, simply occupied. She caught only brief glimpses of him across the palace as he moved from council meetings to military briefings, greeted village elders, reviewed harvest reports, or quietly listened to disputes among neighboring packs. He spoke little, but everyone listened when he did. His authority never relied upon raised voices. Instead, it rested upon calm certainty. One snowy afternoon, Olivia wandered through the palace greenhouse, where winter roses bloomed beneath towering glass ceilings warmed by hidden stone furnaces. She knelt beside a row of delicate white blossoms, carefully trimming wilted leaves the way she had done for years in her family's garden. She became so absorbed in her work that she never noticed another presence until a familiar voice spoke gently behind her. "You saved the healthiest blooms for last." She turned quickly. The Alpha King stood only a few feet away, wearing a simple dark coat instead of formal royal robes. Without the heavy ceremonial attire, he seemed less like a distant ruler and more like an ordinary man enjoying a quiet afternoon. Olivia rose immediately. "Your Majesty." He offered a small smile. "You do not have to stand every time you see me." She hesitated before smiling faintly herself. "It still feels strange." "Does the palace still feel strange?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. She considered answering politely, then decided honesty felt easier. Less than it did. He nodded once, as though that simple answer mattered more than she realized. They walked slowly through the greenhouse together in comfortable silence, pausing occasionally to admire flowering vines climbing ancient stone walls. When a cool breeze drifted through an open window, Olivia instinctively wrapped her arms around herself. Before she could dismiss the chill, the Alpha King quietly removed the elegant wool cloak from his shoulders and placed it gently around hers. The gesture was so natural that it seemed almost practiced. "The greenhouse becomes colder near sunset," he said. "I should have remembered." Olivia looked at him in surprise. "But now you will be cold." He shook his head lightly. "I have lived through many winters." There was no attempt to impress her. No dramatic declaration. Only simple concern expressed through quiet action. As they reached the greenhouse doors, a pair of visiting nobles entered from the opposite corridor. They greeted the Alpha King warmly before their eyes shifted toward Olivia. One of them smiled politely enough, yet his companion spoke just loudly enough to be heard. Political marriages rarely become happy ones. Olivia lowered her eyes without replying. She had expected words like those eventually. Before either noble could continue, the Alpha King calmly stepped beside her instead of ahead of her. His presence alone ended the conversation. He did not argue. He did not criticize. He simply remained standing there until the two visitors respectfully excused themselves and continued down the hall. Olivia looked at him with quiet surprise. For reasons she could not fully explain, The palace no longer felt like a place where she had been sent. It was slowly becoming a place where someone had already decided she belonged. The Grand Council chamber was filled with the quiet murmur of noble voices when Olivia entered beside the Alpha King for the first time as his wife. Sunlight streamed through towering stained glass windows, covering the polished marble floor with soft colors while members of the royal court stood in orderly rows awaiting the morning session. Olivia had spent several days learning palace customs, yet the attention that naturally followed every step she took still felt unfamiliar. She walked calmly, reminding herself that confidence was not the absence of uncertainty, but the choice to keep moving despite it. The Alpha King greeted his advisors with composed warmth before taking his place near the center of the chamber. Olivia quietly stood beside him, careful not to interrupt the formal proceedings. Reports on harvests, trade routes, and village repairs filled the morning with practical discussion. She noticed how patiently he listened before offering even the shortest reply. Every decision reflected thought rather than pride. Watching him lead, she finally understood why so many people respected him without fear. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, an elderly nobleman stepped forward with a courteous bow. "Your Majesty," he began, "may I offer my congratulations on your recent marriage?" The Alpha King acknowledged him with a slight nod. Before anyone expected another word, a younger lord standing nearby smiled politely and added, "It is fortunate that important alliances continue to strengthen the kingdom. Arrangements such as these have always served the crown well." His tone remained respectful, yet the implications settled heavily across the chamber. Olivia lowered her eyes for only a moment. She had heard similar opinions throughout her life. Political marriages belonged to duty, not affection. She reminded herself not to take the remark personally. It was simply how many people viewed such unions. The chamber grew quiet, as everyone waited for the Alpha King's response. Instead of answering immediately, he slowly reached into the leather portfolio resting beside his chair and withdrew the original marriage contract. Every noble recognized the royal seal pressed into the parchment. He laid the document carefully upon the council table without a trace of anger. "This contract fulfilled the law," he said calmly. His voice carried effortlessly through the chamber. "It satisfied our council, honored our traditions, and protected the interests of our people." The younger noble bowed respectfully. "Exactly, Your Majesty." The Alpha King rested one hand gently upon the document before turning toward Olivia. His expression remained composed, yet his golden eyes held unmistakable sincerity. The contract brought Lady Brooks into this palace. He paused just long enough for every person in the chamber to focus on his next words. "Everything that happened afterward was entirely my own choice." Complete silence followed. No one interrupted. No one questioned him. He continued in the same calm voice. "The room prepared for her. The books she enjoys. The flowers beside her window. The breakfast she prefers. The evenings she could rest without unnecessary ceremony. None of those things were required by this agreement." His fingertips lightly touched the edge of the parchment before he gently folded it closed. "Duty asked me to sign this document. My heart asked me to prepare a home before she ever arrived." Olivia looked at him in astonishment, every quiet act of kindness from the past several days suddenly fitting together like pieces of a picture she had never been able to see. The nobles lowered their eyes with respectful understanding. No dramatic declaration echoed through the chamber. There was only the steady truth spoken by a king whose actions had revealed his heart long before his words ever did. And in that peaceful moment, Olivia realized the signature she once believed had ended her future had actually become the first line of the life she had always hoped to find. When the council session finally ended, the nobles departed more quietly than they had arrived, each carrying away the memory of the Alpha King's unexpected words. Olivia remained standing beside the long council table, her thoughts tangled between surprise and gratitude. She had entered the chamber believing herself to be little more than a carefully negotiated alliance. She left wondering whether someone had been quietly choosing her long before the contract ever reached her hands. As the great bronze doors slowly closed behind the last advisor, only she and the Alpha King remained inside the vast chamber. Afternoon sunlight streamed across the polished marble floor, painting golden reflections that stretched between them. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt patient. At last Olivia gathered enough courage to look toward him. "May I ask you something?" she said softly. He turned from the council table and offered the same calm expression she had come to recognize over the past several days. "You may ask me anything." She hesitated, carefully choosing words that had lived inside her heart since Margaret's revelations. "Why me?" The question lingered gently in the quiet chamber. There were countless noble families, countless Omegas whose names carried greater influence than mine. Why did you spend weeks preparing a place for someone you had never even met? The Alpha King remained silent for a thoughtful moment before walking toward the tall windows overlooking the snow-covered valley below. "Because I did meet you," he answered quietly. Olivia looked at him in confusion. He smiled faintly at her expression. "Not in person." He rested one hand lightly upon the stone window frame while watching snowflakes drift beyond the glass. "Every report I received described someone who cared more about others than herself. Every village elder spoke about the young woman who stayed behind after festivals to help clean the square. The local healer told me you always volunteered to gather herbs during winter because the mountain trails frightened everyone else. The librarian said you borrowed books only after making certain every child had chosen theirs first." Olivia listened without moving. She had never imagined those ordinary moments mattered to anyone beyond her small hometown. "Those were simple things," she whispered. "Perhaps." His golden eyes met hers once again. "But kingdoms are not strengthened only by grand victories. They are strengthened by people who choose kindness when no one is watching." Olivia felt her eyes grow warm. For years she had believed her quiet life had gone unnoticed. Yet somehow the man standing before her had seen value in the smallest parts of her character. He stepped closer, leaving respectful space between them. "The council selected names based upon history and alliances," he continued. "I asked for yours because I wanted a queen whose heart already knew how to care for people before wearing a crown." Olivia lowered her gaze as emotion settled gently inside her chest. Every uncertainty she had carried into the palace began to loosen, replaced by something unfamiliar yet comforting. Hope. Outside the window, soft snow continued falling across the palace gardens, covering every path with fresh white light. Olivia slowly smiled, no longer because the palace looked beautiful, but because she finally understood why it had never felt empty. Long before she crossed its gates, someone had already been preparing not simply a royal residence, but a place where the truest parts of her heart would always be welcomed. That evening, the palace hosted a quiet winter gathering for village leaders, scholars, and honored guests who had traveled from every corner of the kingdom. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm candlelight across polished marble, while musicians played gentle melodies that floated through the grand hall without overwhelming the conversations. Olivia stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the snow-covered gardens, still wearing the elegant blue gown prepared for her arrival. Only a few days earlier, she would have felt like an outsider borrowing someone else's life. Tonight, although the uncertainty had not completely disappeared, she no longer felt invisible. She noticed servants greeting her with genuine smiles rather than formal obligation, and several village elders thanked her for speaking kindly with them during the afternoon. Little by little, the palace had begun to feel less like a destination and more like a community. Across the hall, the Alpha King moved gracefully among his guests, listening far more than he spoke. He greeted every visitor with the same quiet respect, whether they represented powerful noble houses or distant farming villages. Olivia watched him from across the room, remembering every conversation they had shared since the day she signed the contract. She now understood that his greatest strength had never been authority alone. It was the remarkable patience with which he noticed people others overlooked. As the evening continued, one distinguished noble approached a small gathering near the fireplace where Olivia had been invited to join several respected families. His smile remained courteous, yet his words carried the polished sharpness often hidden beneath perfect manners. "Her Majesty has adjusted rather quickly," he remarked lightly. "Although I suppose anyone could become comfortable in a palace after receiving such generous treatment." The surrounding guests exchanged uneasy glances. No one wished to embarrass the new queen, yet no one immediately challenged the remark either. Olivia drew a slow breath before offering a calm smile. "I have received kindness," she answered gently. I hope to return it every day I remain here. Her quiet reply surprised several listeners. Before the conversation could continue, the Alpha King approached without haste. He had clearly heard enough to understand what had been said, yet there was no frustration in his expression. He simply stepped beside Olivia with the same composed confidence she had come to trust. The hall gradually fell silent as nearby conversations paused. The noble respectfully bowed his head. Your Majesty. The Alpha King acknowledged him politely before looking toward the gathered guests. A palace becomes worthy of admiration not because of its walls, he said calmly, but because of the people welcomed inside them. He turned slightly toward Olivia, his expression warm with unmistakable sincerity. Lady Brooks has already reminded this kingdom that compassion strengthens every home more effectively than pride ever could. No one argued. There was nothing dramatic about his voice, only quiet conviction that carried naturally through the hall. Several village elders smiled with open approval, while the servants standing nearby exchanged grateful glances. Olivia felt her eyes grow warm once again, not because she stood inside a magnificent palace, but because someone had chosen to honor her character in front of an entire kingdom rather than her family name or the agreement that had brought her there. As music gently filled the hall once more, the Alpha King offered his arm with simple courtesy. Olivia accepted it with a peaceful smile, and together they walked toward the center of the gathering. For the first time since arriving at the palace, she no longer wondered whether she truly belonged there. She already knew the answer, because belonging had never been created by a signature upon parchment. It had been built one quiet act of kindness at a time. Several weeks later, the first heavy snowfall of the season blanketed the palace gardens in brilliant white, transforming every path, fountain, and ancient oak into a quiet masterpiece touched by winter. Olivia stepped onto the stone terrace wrapped in the familiar royal cloak that had long since become her favorite companion during cold mornings. She paused beside the balcony overlooking the valley below, watching children from the nearby village laugh as they built snow figures beyond the palace gates. Their joyful voices drifted upward on the crisp breeze, carrying a warmth that no winter could ever silence. Behind her, the terrace doors opened softly. The Alpha King joined her without ceremony, carrying 2 steaming cups of herbal tea. He handed one to her with the same effortless thoughtfulness that had quietly shaped every day since her arrival. Olivia accepted it with a grateful smile before looking out across the kingdom once more. Everything feels different now, she admitted. When I first arrived, I believed every hallway inside this palace would remind me that I did not belong here. The Alpha King rested his hands lightly upon the stone railing. And now, she smiled as snowflakes settled gently across the gardens below. Now I cannot remember the last time I felt like a stranger. He remained, silent for a moment, watching the peaceful landscape together with her. That was my greatest hope, he said quietly. Olivia turned toward him with gentle curiosity. Not that I would become queen. He shook his head. Crowns can be placed upon anyone's head. His golden eyes reflected the pale winter sunlight with calm sincerity. Feeling at home cannot. His words settled softly into the quiet morning. Olivia looked down at the warm cup resting between her hands, remembering the frightened young woman who had stood inside the council chamber, believing one's signature had closed every door behind her. She remembered the sleepless nights before the wedding, the uncertainty, the carefully guarded expectations, and the promise she had made to herself never to expect more than duty. Yet every day afterward had gently rewritten that belief through simple moments no contract had ever required. A favorite breakfast waiting at sunrise. Fresh lilies beside the window. Books arranged with care. A warm cloak offered without hesitation. A patient conversation instead of distant formality. Respect given before affection was ever requested. None of those memories had arrived with grand speeches. They had arrived quietly, one thoughtful gesture at a time, until they became something stronger than fear. Olivia looked toward the palace behind them. The grand halls no longer seemed intimidating. The towering windows no longer felt unfamiliar. Even the servants greeting her each morning now smiled with the easy warmth of old friends. She finally understood that home was never measured by the place where someone was born. It was measured by the place where they were genuinely welcomed. The Alpha King reached into his coat, and carefully unfolded a single piece of parchment before handing it to her. Olivia recognized it immediately. It was the marriage contract they had signed together. Across the bottom, beneath both of their signatures, he had written one additional sentence in elegant handwriting. Every promise written above brought us together. Everything we build from this day forward will be written by our own choice. Olivia felt tears gather quietly in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming peace of realizing that the future she had once feared had become the safest place she had ever known. She folded the parchment carefully before slipping her hand into his, and together they stood watching fresh snow fall across a kingdom that no longer felt divided by duty or expectation. It felt united by kindness, quiet trust, and the simple truth that the strongest homes are never built by contracts alone, but by two hearts choosing the same place, day after day, long after the ink has dried.